He had taken off his jacket and wrapped it over the shoulders of his two sleeping children on the clinic bench, and no one noticed the man sleeping on the steps until the generator wheezed and the lights in the ward dimmed. The first image that stayed was simple and sharp. A father curled against stone, breath fogging in the night air, his small satchel of tools resting beside him like an old friend. The corridor smelled of antiseptic, boiled rice, and wet wool from a hoodie left on a chair. The metal handrail was warm under the child's palm where she held on. The distant hiss of a leaking radiator measured time and tiny, anxious ticks. He looked like someone who had run out of luck, but not out of hands that knew how to fix things. His coat was patched, his shoes were thin and shiny with mud, yet his fingers moved like a practiced locksmith when he tested the socket on the emergency panel with the back of his knuckle. A nurse muttered, a security guard straightened, and someone in the waiting room drew a slow picture on their phone of the man sleeping outside. He woke, not with indignation, but with a modest request. A mug of coffee and a chance to check the generator. There was a promise in that ask that stretched beyond the night. If he could not get the generator to steady in the next 20 minutes, the neonatal incubator on the second floor would begin to overheat, and two premature infants might have to be transferred down the cramped, dangerous roads. Nobody guessed then that the choice made at the end of that bench would ripple through a neighborhood that had learned to expect small rescues, not miracles. Diego had been in the shadows of the city for years, a presence more felt than seen. He was 37, sinewy, with knuckles scored by wire, and a voice that held the soft burr of someone who had taught himself how to listen. Around him were the people who would later be named in news reports and funding proposals. Rosa, the night nurse whose laugh was short and efficient. Javier, the retired mechanic who smoked on the stoop and still kept a box of fuses. Elena, a volunteer at the shelter. Omar, a bus driver who donated coffee. Samira, a local reporter who freelanced for the regional paper. Tomas, the clinic administrator who kept a ledger of small kindnesses. And Mayor Alvarez, who would only arrive later when the crowd could no longer be ignored. Those people moved through the scene like light through smoke, each with their own incredulity and their own way of keeping working things moving. The kids, Sofia and Mateo, slept with a plastic toy between them. The toy clicked softly when Mateo shifted, a tiny mechanical heartbeat in the hush. The security guard crossed his arms and asked if Diego was authorized to touch hospital equipment. Diego answered, "If you cut the feed here, I can check the regulator. I only need a screwdriver." The guard hesitated, the nurse nodded, and the air tightened like the inside of a held breath. Diego did not come in with tools that announced themselves. His satchel was a stained satchel of mixed parts, a retouched manometer peeking from a pocket, an old adjustable wrench wrapped in cloth, a small nebulizer mask he had salvaged from another life. He carried the kind of instruments that had names, but also stories stitched into their metal. He unzipped the control panel with fingers that smelled faintly of oil and lemon soap. For the first 10 minutes, a room of professionals watched him like a slow experiment. He ran his palms over the generator's casing, listening, feeling for vibration and heat as if the machine had a pulse to read. He spoke in short technical phrases, the kind of sentences that are both instruction and translation. "I will isolate the line, check the regulator, clean the corroded contact, retighten the ground. If the voltage still droops, we swap the capacitor and recalibrate the throttle." A young nurse, Rosa, asked what recalibrate the throttle meant. He smiled and made it plain. "It is the governor that tells the engine how fast to spin. If the governor is slow, the load takes the lights down." The explanation was one part metaphor, one part exactness. Within 20 minutes, the generator had steadied into a low, confident hum. The incubator monitors resumed a steady beep. Someone exhaled and began to clap, a small relieved sound that spread like warmth. The first immediate fix showed something that the clinic had known but rarely acknowledged. Competence does not always come in uniforms. That night, in a cluster of 8 to 10 exchanges of short, charged dialogue, the staff and bystanders argued through their assumptions. "Who is he?" Tomas asked. A neighbor, Elena said. He sleeps outside sometimes, Omar added. You saw him at the bus stop with parts, Javier said with a nod. But is it safe? The security guard insisted. What if he made it worse? Samira, who had already started recording on the edge of the corridor, looked up and said, We should document. People need to know this. Diego answered softly, I do this for the kids in the shelter sometimes. If you let me, I will check the governor and the regulator. I will clean the carburetor jets if they are dirty. Rosa, with a guarded face, asked, Why would you do this and sleep outside? He looked toward the sleeping children and said, They stayed warm. My wife runs the shelter. She had to keep the heaters running for 3 more families. The back and forth kept the scene alive. 8 exchanges of skepticism, practicality, and mercy that turned suspicion into a fragile truce. The younger nurses shifted from doubt to watchful trust. Javier, who had seen engines die and resurrect, offered a small box of fuses from his coat pocket without a word. Samira kept filming, not for spectacle, but because stories often begin with small recorded truths. Diego accepted a cup of coffee and a screwdriver, and, with the modesty of someone who has learned to trade labor for moments of safety, continued. He had done quick fixes before, patching a leaking oxygen line at a street clinic, improvising a nebulizer mask with tubing and a syringe when supplies ran out, rethreading a corroded regulator to steady pressure. Each procedure was an exercise in language, technical terms made plain. For instance, when Diego explained isolating a line, he said, You cut the circuit to the panel, then test the input at the terminal. If the voltage is normal, the problem sits after the feed, often in the regulator or relay. That explanation, compressed to 2 sentences, was a procedure of about 300 characters that cleared a room of speculation and allowed practical action. The nurse who had feared a liability instead watched a man apply dated technique and new improvisation to an old problem. And the clinic turned from a site of potential crisis into a hive of cooperative repair. People who had been ready to record an argument found themselves cataloging parts and shuttling batteries. Diego's intervention was small but precise, and when the generator hummed steadily into the night, it left a residue of changed expectations. The second demonstration came the next afternoon, when the clinic's small immunization refrigerator began to register rising temperature during a storm. This time the setting was different. The pharmacy room smelled of cold medicine and wet street dust. Fluorescent light hummed with a staccato tremor. A vial clinked in a tray. A janitor, Elena, had tied her hair back with a scrap of ribbon and watched him with a frown. Diego arrived with Sofia and Mateo at his side and a folded piece of plywood under his arm. The problem was mechanical, but the stakes were public. If the refrigeration failed, hundreds of routine vaccines might be ruined and appointments rescheduled, a ripple that would affect clinics across the district. Diego opened the unit, fingers careful as a surgeon. Compressor sounds like it's starving, he said. He ran a warm palm over the condenser coils, felt for cold spots, and checked the manometer he'd carried in his satchel. He described in plain words the procedure he would use. I will check the refrigerant pressure, listen for leaks, test the compressor clutch, and, if needed, swap the start capacitor. It was a run of 5 sensory details in that small room. Hiss of the coolant, metallic tang in the air, the slick texture of oily hands, the small buzz from the thermostat, and the cold sting of the vent. The dialogue in that scene stretched in a patient aid exchange pattern. "Do you have a cert for this?" Tomas asked. "No," Diego replied, "but I have done this for years." Rosa intervened with a protective question. "If you fail, who pays?" Diego thought for a beat and shrugged. "I pay by fixing what I can. I ask only that if I save these shots, you store a set of emergency vials for the shelter." The trade was practical and humane. When the compressor roared back and the thermostat read steady degrees, children in the waiting room clapped as if someone had rewound time. The volunteers who had been doubtful now moved to help catalog the saved vials. Samira, who had been briefed by Tomas on the clinic's petty budgets, began to sketch the lines of a story that would complicate simplistic charity. By the time the small videos and a terse neighborhood post began to circulate, the private labor of Diego moved into a public question. Within a couple of days, shares and messages reached people who had never walked the clinic's corridor. 3 local merchants who promised thermal blankets, a teacher who offered a room for storage, and a software volunteer who proposed a simple inventory spreadsheet. Viralization did not arrive as a tidal wave, but as a ring of messages passed from person to person. Samira, the reporter, tagged her small clip with a headline that balanced shock with respect. Father who slept outside to warm his children stabilizes clinic generator. People she named in her piece were those who had been present: Rosa, Elena, Javier, Tomas, and Omar. Emails came from a community foundation and a nearby college that offered a lab for testing old capacitors. Offers poured in, some clumsy, some sincere. A private contractor proposed a paid contract to rehabilitate the clinic's power system, but with conditions: public promotions and a spotlight event that would put Diego at the center, not as a craftsman, but as an image. A manufacturer offered 2 replacement generators in exchange for branding rights in the waiting area. The reactions varied from gratitude to unease. The crowd outside the clinic swelled in reported numbers and in goodwill. People left scarves and cups labeled with their names. Diego's mailbox was not yet large, but his reputation had grown. This was the moment of a dilemma that tightened like a throat. Diego kept refusing offers that felt like spectacle. At a short, pointed interview, Samira asked him, in a back-and-forth that lasted more than the camera's attention, whether he wanted publicity. "Why do you refuse help that comes with strings?" she asked. "Because I am not charity entertainment," Diego replied. "I fix what needs fixing. I do not want my kids to be told they are part of a show." He recounted a backstory in 3 compact paragraphs that together reached close to 900 characters. He explained that his mother taught him how to take apart a clock when he was 10, that his father had been a night guard who knew how to listen to machines, and that the family had learned austerity not as virtue but as necessity. He described leaving a formal job years ago when the factory closed so he could be present for his children, taking odd jobs at the clinic or on buses, sleeping outside when it meant the family could keep the heater on inside. Those paragraphs mapped a life of patchwork choices, of skills passed down, and of dignity preserved. The backstory was not a plea, but context. A man who held to a rule that accepting help must not be the same as selling out. His refusal to become a spectacle was a moral stance that complicated offers and forced the community to negotiate assistance on his terms. The crisis that would define the neighborhood's collective response arrived during a bitter cold snap weeks later. The clinic's main compressor, an aging unit that kept the ward's oxygen concentrators and sterilization tools cool, failed at 3 in the morning. Patients arrived in boots glazed with ice. The air smelled of hot syrup and old disinfectant. The fluorescent tubes flickered like tired eyelids. The compressor was old, its metal flaking with rust. Technicians called in from neighboring districts were delayed by traffic, and a transfer of critical patients would mean dangerous travel in sub-zero conditions. This was the true test, a high-pressure situation where a technical failure would force medical decisions. The scene demanded a major repair under strict time pressure, and it required someone who could think across electricity, pressure, and logistics. Diego stepped forward, and the hospital staff, after heated debate and a series of measured, tense dialogues, allowed him to lead a repair team. The exchanges in that scene were long and precise, at least 10 to 14 in count, each one carrying the weight of trust and the possibility of failure. "Can you guarantee it?" "No guarantee, only a plan," Diego replied. "What do you need?" Rosa asked. "Clamps, new start relay, a multimeter, and a ladder," he listed. Javier offered his own tools. Omar brought hot coffee. Elena organized volunteers. Samira switched her recording to low profile, filming only the hands. Mayor Alvarez called to ask if the clinic needed municipal help, and Diego said he did not want political stages, he wanted bolts. The room budgeted time like medicine. Every exchange shortened into a specific task and a specific promise. Who would hold the light? Who would find the spare relay? Who would clear the stairwell for stretcher access? The technical procedure that followed was extensive and required an exactitude of description because so much depended on it. In clear, accessible terms, Diego outlined the steps to repair the compressor and stabilize the system. First, he directed the isolation of the main feed to the compressor and the placement of lockout tags to ensure no accidental re-energization. Then he explained the diagnostic sequence. Measure input voltage at the compressor terminals to rule out supply sag. Test the start capacitor with an analog meter because digital meters can misreport short transients. Check the clutch engagement on the motor for mechanical seizure by manually spinning the shaft once the unit was safely de-energized. Inspect the refrigerant lines with a soap solution to detect micro-leaks. Verify oil levels and clean the condenser fins to improve heat exchange. He described, in technical but plain language, how to swap a failing start relay. Disconnect the relay, confirm continuity and resistance on the coil, match the new relay specifications to the compressor's rating, and mount it with vibration washers to prevent future loosening. The full sequence was practical and exact, about 1,700 characters in explanation, and Diego spoke each line as if translating from machine language into human care. He paused to instruct volunteers on safety. Always ground the chassis before touching electrical terminals. Never attempt to start the motor without ensuring the start capacitor is within tolerance. And log each step for later audit. The procedure required both the delicate touch of a mechanic and the discipline of a clinic protocol. Hands moved in a coordinated improvisation, bolts turned, wires were replaced, and the compressor, after a tense minute of silence, coughed and then resumed a steady, sure rhythm. The relief was audible, a soft chorus of praise and tears. Within that repair scene, there were moments of concentrated tension that the crowd later recalled in specific detail. In two short sections of about 500 to 600 characters each, the strain is compressed into memory. First, the minute when the lights went out as a technician attempted to start the motor, plunging the ward into blue-black and leaving monitors on emergency battery. People froze. A baby emitted a thin cry like a distant bell. Under the dim emergency lamps, Diego's hands felt for the relay, his tongue pressed to the inside of his cheek, and he worked with steady breaths. A volunteer whispered a prayer. The second tense moment came when, after the relay had been replaced, the compressor initially ran but then stalled, a grinding note emanating from the casing. Someone shouted that the motor was locked. Diego ordered everyone back, opened the casing, found a lodged rag in the impeller, and extracted it with gloved hands. Both moments, each a little over 500 characters, knitted the team together. The crowd learned to trust the rhythm of competence under pressure. What followed after the repair was not a single act of rescue, but a series of community decisions to formalize response. The clinic and neighborhood volunteers convened a meeting to organize a small social workshop dedicated to maintenance and dignity. They named 8 people to roles: Diego as lead technician and mentor, Rosa as clinical liaison, Javier as equipment sourcing, Elena coordinating volunteers, Omar in logistics and transport, Samira in communications and documentation, Tomas handling inventory and records, and Mayor Alvarez assigned a council aide to liaise with municipal procurement. They rented an old room behind the clinic and converted it into a modest repair shop. The space smelled of oil and lemon cleaner. Fluorescent lights cast a steady white over benches of reclaimed wood. Shelves held labeled boxes of capacitors, regulators, gauges, and a neat row of manometers. Rules were simple and humane. People would not be filmed while seeking help. Repairs would be offered for a suggested donation rather than forced charity, and all records would be transparent to an oversight committee of 3 community members. Volunteers wore simple aprons and name tags. Hand tools received cleaning and retirement dates. A logbook was opened to track parts and labor. The scene provided rich sensory detail as the workshop came alive. Clink of metal, faint smoke of solder, the rough texture of used gloves, the low hum of a donated drill, and the smell of coffee passed in paper cups. The workshop began offering scheduled repair slots, training sessions, and a small lending library of tools so neighborhood residents could learn basics. In the first week, they repaired hospital equipment, mended a donated nebulizer, and rewired an old sterilizer. Their success was tangible and immediate, but the project faced a new challenge: scaling while staying true to values. A larger institutional problem emerged when a regional supply chain failure meant that hospital-grade compressors were backordered for months. The clinic needed backup plans and a coordinated logistics response. This required a procedural plan of about 600 characters for delegation and leadership. Map resource dependencies, identify alternate suppliers, including local technical colleges, negotiate short-term loans of equipment, and schedule rotating maintenance teams to extend life of existing units. Diego set up a rotation, Javier and Omar organized transport, and Samira helped create transparent logs to show donors how funds and parts were used. The coordination expanded outward. A network of 5 neighboring clinics agreed to share spare parts. A local technical institute offered a classroom for advanced training. The workshop began to think in chains rather than in isolated fixes. It had to reconcile immediate technical needs with long-term procurement and training. As the group's reputation grew, so did administrative scrutiny. An audit request arrived from the municipal office requesting itemized receipts and accountability for donated funds. The workshop responded with a simple system that a volunteer accountant, Anna, helped design. Records showed parts used, hours volunteered, and beneficiaries served. The transparency calmed donors and increased referrals. In meetings with municipal staff, Mayor Alvarez argued for a modest grant to fund inventory and safety equipment, insisting that the project had already created measurable public good. The clinic began to document metrics: number of repairs made, patients whose care was uninterrupted, hours of volunteer labor, and a small count of lives indirectly preserved. A ledger that tethered human stories to concrete numbers. It was a pragmatic step toward institutional stability without sacrificing the ethos of dignity that had driven Diego. 1 month after the first night on the clinic steps, the city noticed more than a clip on social feeds. The workshop had logged 42 repairs, trained 18 volunteers in basic diagnostics, and secured a small inventory of spare capacitors and regulators donated by a technical college. Practical changes showed quickly. Fewer power interruptions, a refrigerated vaccine cabinet operating on a verified schedule, and the neonatal ward reporting no temperature-related incidents. The mood in the clinic shifted. Nurses reported a lighter strain in the night shift, and the shelter where Diego's wife worked received a small allocation of blankets from local merchants who had been moved by the story. Diego maintained a quiet routine. He still slept on the edge of his children's space when funds were tight, choosing warmth for his family over his own comfort. The community formalized a petty fund for emergency parts, and Samira published a more studied piece quoting Rosa on the importance of respect for practical skill. The first month was mostly about stabilization and proving the model could work without spectacle. 3 months in, the project had scaled in practical terms and in relationships. The workshop had moved to a larger donated space behind the clinic and had expanded its volunteer roster to 52 people, including students from the Technical Institute and a retired biomedical engineer who offered weekly office hours. The inventory had grown to include a backup compressor, a bank of tested capacitors, and a calibrated manometer station for pressure checks. The clinic's audit system showed meticulous transparency. Logs were publicly viewable and donations were tracked by project, not by person. The community had repaired 154 pieces of equipment across the district and avoided at least 27 potential equipment-related cancellations or transfers. 10 local families received heating assistance through coordinated donations rather than media-driven campaigns. Diego had become a mentor, teaching 3-hour workshops on basic diagnostics. He refused applause and refused a singular title, insisting on shared credit. His small family life had some stability. His children were enrolled in an after-school program funded by community microdonations, and his wife received a small stipend for her shelter work. The project's success generated conversations at City Council about investing in decentralized maintenance models rather than centralized replacements. At 6 months, the legacy took a firmer, measurable shape. The network included 7 clinics and 2 community centers in the district, a roster of more than 100 trained volunteers, and an audited fund that had supported the purchase of 2 backup generators, a set of professional-grade tools, and a modest repair van for emergency calls. The workshop recorded 412 repairs since the first night, with a documented maintenance schedule that reduced downtime by 60% for participating clinics. The municipal council approved a seed grant for training and a small line item for emergency parts. Mayor Alvarez attended a low-key meeting and pledged logistical support, but kept the tone careful to avoid political spectacle. The community developed a charter that prioritized dignity, privacy, and training. Diego and his family were offered stable housing options through a local nonprofit, but he negotiated terms. Any relocation must allow him to remain close to the workshop and keep evening hours for training. He wanted integration, not displacement. The 6-month picture included numbers, names, and sentiments. Javier continued to source parts. Rosa remained the clinical anchor. Elena coordinated volunteers. Omar still brought thermos coffee to night shifts. Samira continued responsible reporting, and Thomas kept the ledgers. The final impression was not of a rescued man, but of an amplified community resource that had learned to translate private skill into public resilience. The conclusion pulled tight the thread that began with a man sleeping outside to keep his children warm and a single modest request for a screwdriver. The contrast remained: a father with threadbare shoes and a satchel of scavenged tools, a community that had once laughed or turned away, and then a city that learned to measure care beyond headlines. Tangible results were clear. In 6 months, a network of clinics reduced equipment downtime by majority percentages. Hundreds of scheduled appointments were kept, and a small grant stabilized the workshop. Diego's final words to the group were simple and dignified. "I do not want a statue. I want a place where hands learn and where kids do not have to choose warmth over sleep." That line stood as his moral choice, and the community honored it by building a training schedule and protecting the privacy of those who sought help. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes practical help and dignity can go together. There is power in telling how neighbors answer each other. The city had not been fixed in a day. It had been found, repaired, and taught to care, repair by repair.